Hello, welcome to Missional Amphibians and the first of a series of devotionals out of the book of James called called A Daily Walk Through the Book of James. And we're going to start with chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. I'm going to read it here for you. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. This book is written to the Jewish diaspora of believers throughout the world. It would be kind of the Mediterranean world at that time. And so it's kind of a general letter of James and not to one specific region or city like a lot of the other letters, but it's a general letter. And consider it pure joy, my brothers, verse 2, and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Look at that gender-inclusive language there. That's good, brothers and sisters. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. One of the things that I think is interesting about this text is when we think about trials and testing, and we think about how that really is a particularly Christian paradigm. You know, when you ask someone in the world who doesn't believe in the Bible or Christian worldview, what is a trial? What is a testing? They would say, well, you know, a test to get into a job or to get into a college or to get good grades, you know. A trial would be, you know, if you're in front of a judge and giving testimony or something. But so really these concepts are foreign to the average person, the average, you know, secular Western person. And so it's interesting just to recognize that this idea, it's a very Christian, very particularly Christian idea, this idea of trials. You don't see this idea in a lot of other religions, you know, in the same way that you see in the Bible. The Bible talks about testing, how God, who already knows everything before it happens, he tests us. He allows difficulties. A test is a challenge. A test is not just any difficulty we go through. You know, sometimes we bring things on ourselves. You know, a lot of times people even talk about the cross. Oh, my marriage is a cross, you know, or my job is, or you know, just anything that I don't like in my life is a cross. But the Christian idea of the cross is the suffering and the difficulties that we go through, the burden, which is directly related to us fulfilling God's call on our life. It's not just anything that's disagreeable or uncomfortable is the cross. Or it's not just that anything that's disagreeable or uncomfortable is a trial or a tribulation, but it's those things that are directly related to us being disciples of Christ and endeavoring to fulfill our call. And so trials and tribulations, tests, as it says here in the NIV, it says that know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And there in verse 4, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So perseverance, you know, I think it was Alan Redpath who someone asked him once, how long do you prepare for a sermon? And he said, well, usually about 5 years. And what he meant was that, you know, anything that he shares with authority is not something that he just picked up from a theological book, or, you know, or even the meditations of that week. You know, the most authoritative things come from our life experience and our life message. And one of the things that's been really strong in my life message and experience has been understanding what perseverance is in the whole counsel of God. Because everyone's got a different perspective, but it's funny, when I look at perseverance, in my life, I look at least in the more recent part of my life, perhaps I would say, I've seen that perseverance is something that I've had to come to understand, in that sometimes you need to know when to stop persevering. And, you can't, perseverance can become a legalistic weight if you just think, hey, you should never stop doing anything. You should never, and people who know me probably know where I'm coming from, because, 2.5 years ago, our family went through a huge transition of, living in Brazil as church planners and moving back to Southern California with a big question mark of how God was going to continue to use us in ministry and how we were going to support ourselves financially. And that change was so difficult. And I came to a moment where I had to not persevere anymore in that direction. Me and Katie, we had to start persevering and start going in a new direction. And I guess you don't start persevering when you go in a new direction. That, I guess that's one of the things about persevering, is that it's one thing when God gives you a new vision, He gives you a new direction. And a lot of times, I remember when I was at Fuller Seminary, one of the biggest things that I thought was encouraging and interesting was the whole study of leadership development and how it develops over different phases of our lives. And one of the things that often precipitates a transition time in our life is the desire for some kind of training. We find ourselves feeling kind of like restless and feeling like, I feel like there's something new that I want to do, but I feel like I might need some training. And so, a new time of your life might start with that, a class, or it might start with some kind of research or whatever. But when some transition time starts in your life, there's that euphoric time of making the decision and praying and but then if you go in that direction, eventually there comes the time where that becomes the new norm, and then you have to persevere. And my dad used to tell me in missions, especially in the beginning of my career in missions, first 7 years I was involved in short-term missions, leading teams. And I went to several different missions bases, pretty much like I probably moved around like every year and a half or so for about 7 years. And I remember talking to my dad once about how excited I was about some, new place I was going to go. And I don't know why my dad said this. I think it might have been the time I was going to Hawaii or something to do some kind of new class. But I remember my dad saying, yeah, that's so cool, Dave, but just remember when you get there, it's still just going to be life. It's still going to be challenges. And I can't remember the whole context. Knowing my dad, I'm sure that I had led him to respond that way. Because my dad's always so encouraging, so positive. To get something like that from my dad that brings the negative side, it's not so normal. My dad's really positive, encouraging. But it was interesting because that stuck with me that, yeah, there's that euphoric, like, hey, there's something new. But at some point you hit the place where the new is the norm, and then now you have to persevere. And so perseverance is something that here it says, that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And then it says, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So perseverance has to finish its work so that you may be mature. I remember one time near the end of my time in Brazil, and Brazil is still in our hearts. We're actually planning on going to Brazil at the end of the year. And, but towards the end of our time living there, I remember one time I was teaching at a YWAM school, and someone asked me a question. I remember I was telling them, it's better to end a phase of your life in discouragement than to end your life in discouragement. And again, this verse here, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. The opposite of that would be, running away from things anytime there's adversity, whether it's a relationship, people run away from their relationships with leaders and disciplers, relationships in their family, relationships with their spouse, relationships with their parents. Perseverance has to finish its works so that you may be mature and complete. And complete, I think it's interesting because it goes on and it says not lacking anything, prosperity, having the things you need, not being, in debt or in trouble in terms of the basic needs of your life. You have to know how to persevere, and that will bring maturity and bring the fruit in your life. And so, but again, it's interesting because sometimes it's hard for us to realize that when there has been that completion and now it's time for us to move on. And it's so interesting too because we ask so often, I find myself asking me these questions about the things that I do daily. Hey, how long am I going to be doing this for? Am I in a holding pattern for something else? Is this what I'm doing right now going to be of great significance? Am I going to do this for the next, however, 10, 20 years? And I think about all the energy we spend thinking that and asking those questions, and how much better it would be often for us to just focus on doing our best in the place where God has planted us at the moment. And, it's so crushing. I remember when I was at different places on the mission field long term, I would hear people saying like, oh, I bought my burial stone, or my burial plot, and I'm going to be buried here in whatever country, in, Croatia or Ghana or whatever. And it's so funny because in my experience, the missionaries who said, or even urban missionaries, when I worked in like downtown inner city LA, that kind of stuff, the missionaries who would say that kind of stuff, kind of like verbally convincing others and trying to convince themselves of how long term they were, a lot of times those are the ones that didn't really actually last very long. And I'm not judging them. I don't even think it's wrong to say that. Maybe we say a lot of things that we don't understand, and then who cares? I'm not trying to judge them because that didn't happen. But a lot of the people, I'll say in my experience personally, the best way that I've been able to persevere in one long stretch in a physical location or in a specific ministry or a job has been just taking it a day at a time. Having vision, of course, believing in what you're doing, believing that God can use that to train you and to bless others, and that, who knows, would it be so terrible if you did this for the rest of your life? Being willing to live that sacrifice, but just taking it a day at a time. And then looking back, you'd be like, wow, I just did this for a year. Wow, I just did it for 5, 10 years, but not taking such a weight on you, persevering until perseverance finishes its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So moving on to verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave on the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. I think it's so interesting here. I even thought of maybe just leaving those other verses for the next study, because this is all, hearing God's voice. It's the number one theme of every Christian bookstore. How to discern the will of God. This is such a popular theme. My grandma, Joy Dawson, has written tons of, all of her books in some way are related to this. This is a huge thing in my family that I've always been, when I think of the Christian life, it's directly related to the idea of hearing God's voice. But I think one of the interesting things that I just want to hit on here is the idea that you must believe. When you ask for wisdom from God, you must believe. And it's like it says in Hebrews 11 that he who seeks God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. And so it's the attitude of faith is essential. The attitude of surrender is essential. And faith and surrender are totally connected, because faith is basically you letting go of what gives you security and stepping out. Faith is not an emotion. Faith is not, a whipped up, fervor of emotion or outward things like, faith can be expressed in a declaration, in a song, in a hallelujah, in a big service with thousands of people. That's great, you know. I'm from Pentecostal. That's the cloth I'm cut from. You know, I believe in the gifts of the Spirit, and I love a good prayer meeting and a good worship time with the gifts of the Spirit moving. But faith, ultimately, in in the Christian in the Christian understanding, as I interpret it, it really is something that is manifest in trust. Trust can be still. Sometimes faith doesn't always have to be acting in terms of producing things. Sometimes faith could just be standing still and knowing that He is God. And then also faith is over and over, the Bible talks about it being manifest in a step of faith, in action. And so this is the thing that really hits me. You know, the scariest verse of the Bible is the very many times that Jesus said, "He who has will be given more, and he who doesn't have, the little that he has will be taken from him. He'll lose it." And Jesus is talking about faith. You know, if you have faith, you will receive more and more that which you believe for, according to God's will. But he who doesn't have faith, it's like you're losing ground. It's so dangerous to not believe because you're losing ground. And the more you walk in unbelief, the more you will lose. The more will be taken away from you, you know. And it's not that God, I don't believe, I mean, there is discipline. You know, God can touch our lives. I mean, in a sense that he allows difficulty. Well, don't worry, I'm not going to try to get into explaining exactly how difficult things happen to Christians and God's discipline. I mean, that's a huge, you know, Christians have been debating that for 1,000 years. But just to say that there is suffering in our lives, and as we go through that, it tests our faith. That's what it says right here. Our faith is being tested. And if we let that kind of darken our hearts, and it's like a cloud comes over us, and we can't believe anymore, even as we ask God questions, we're not really able to receive. We're not really able to receive because we're asking Him with a preconceived notion of what He can't say. And you know, it's I'll end with this. You know, I was talking to my brother recently. He was visiting from New Zealand, and we were talking about what we're doing in our lives, and he was asking me about, can you see what you're doing right now really flourishing into the long-term goals, things that God has in your life? And it was interesting because I said to him, you know what? That's an interesting question, because if I absolutely don't believe that what I'm doing now can lead into the ultimate flourishing and fulfillment of His will in my life, if I was to tell you, no, I can't see how this could lead me into God's purposes, and the dreams and the promises He's given me, you know, in times past. If I was to say that I don't believe that, then I wouldn't be able to get through another day of what I do. My responsibilities, ministry, work, family. I wouldn't be able to get through another day. I have to believe that somehow it can be this road I'm on and what I'm doing right now can be the right place, and it's actually the ingredients and it's the soil that God will use to bring forth His will. I have to believe that. But it's something to take very seriously, because if you doubt, the other side of what I'm saying is that if you doubt that what you're doing right now could lead to the fulfillment of the promises that God has for you, would you have the courage to admit it? Because as soon as you admit it, it's like all your motivation just falls through the ground. At least for me it is. So that's where you have to be really honest, you know. I'm an introspective introvert, you know. I'm a INTJ on the Myers-Briggs, which is the most kind of nerd out, introspective, kind of selfish, you know, whatever, I guess, kind of conceptual person in the Myers-Briggs testing. The one of the upsides of my profile, the intuitive introvert, is that we do have good self-knowledge. And so, that's one of the things that scares me, to just be about, hey, am I really honest with myself? Or am I just too scared to ask the real question? Do I believe that where I'm at right now and what I'm engaged in can lead to the fulfilling of the promises God's given me? If I really was to say, you know what, I don't know, man, this might be totally off. I know that come Monday, how will I get out of bed? If I just don't know, this might all be pointless, Because that still is the point in my life. I want to receive the greater things God has. I want to enter into all that he has. So I have to believe. So again, just finishing up here, he who lacks wisdom asks God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. So it's faith, brothers and sisters. That's the key. That's the key to hearing God's voice. Of course, there's other things too. We got to have personal holiness. We got to read his word. We got to be in fellowship with the church. But here, I love this, that you must believe. You must believe. You have to approach him with an attitude of faith. So we went on a little bit longer than I thought. I'm still trying to figure out how long these devotionals are going to go. This is the first edition of Missional Amphibians monthly devotional. Maybe I can start doing this weekly. I'd love to, or bi-weekly. Let's do that. Let's make a deal. Let's do it every 2 weeks. Starting now, that's going to be my goal. I love deadlines because that helps me to get things done. So I'm planning on getting these out every 2 weeks, and I hope that you'll be blessed. I hope that God can encourage you from the words of his Holy Scripture that we've shared today. God bless you.